Hello and welcome to the ADVERTS webinar. The ADVERTS project was focused on the topic of minimizing distraction from roadside billboards, and it was undertaken on behalf of CEDA by SWAV, TRL and VIAS. Bit of background to the project. Really, the starting point is that we know distraction is a major challenge for road safety, and in modern driving, there are many sources of distraction, both the things inside the vehicle and outside. And as I said, the ADVERTS project was focused on one of these outside distraction areas, which is adverts on billboards. The objective of the project was simple. It was to provide evidence-based recommendations for road authorities on how to minimize these negative safety impacts from roadside advertising. And we covered a range of features and things about billboards, so their location, physical features, and the content on them, and so on. And we looked both at the scientific knowledge and at current practice. Now, it's worth saying at this point, from a safety point of view, of course, you could argue that a complete prohibition of advertising visible from the road would be the optimal solution. But we think that that's difficult or even impossible to implement in practice. And we took a pragmatic approach in this project. We were keen that the recommendations given were useful to any road authority, no matter how much control they have over this particular area of risk. And of course, that is something which varies across different countries. The level of control a given road authority has is not set. So the recommendations are aimed to assist those decision makers who have some control, and we anticipate that some authorities will be able to use more of these recommendations than others. The approach we took is summarized on this slide. So we undertook a review of the scientific knowledge and scientific evidence around distraction and roadside billboards, and we also took an inventory of current practices. We also took the outcome of those activities to a workshop with stakeholders, and really all of this came together in the different documents on this slide to a final recommendations document and an infographic. What I'll do now is I'll outline the 10 main recommendations from the project. These describe essentially recommended practice for the implementation of roadside advertising. Now, of course, in the full recommendation report, scientific justification for each is provided, and also illustrative examples of existing practice where they exist are given. And for all that detail, I'd refer you to the recommendations report. What I'll do now is go through the recommendations one at a time with some summary of where they've come from. So the first recommendation concerns confusion with road signs. And the recommendation is simply that billboards which can be confused with road signs in terms of their size, their shape, their color, their content, or any combination of these should never be allowed. And the reasoning here is more common sense, really, that road signs, for example, things like direction signs, signs giving orders such as speed limits and so on, these are essential parts of providing relevant information to motorists to facilitate the smooth and safe operation of traffic. And billboards which resemble these could easily cause drivers to become confused, leading to potential negative impacts on traffic flow and safety. The second recommendation, again, is quite a common sense one, and it concerns blocking other road signs and traffic signals with billboards. And the recommendation is that this should never be allowed. So billboards should never be located in such a way as to obstruct or hinder road users' view of road signs, traffic signals, or any road infrastructure, including the road, incidentally, which may be critical to their understanding of the road system. And again, this is a common sense recommendation. If a billboard is obstructing infrastructure which provides critical information, then this effectively removes that critical information from drivers and road users. And it's worth noting that by blocking road users' views, what we mean here is often it's physical obstruction, as implied here in the infographic. But it could also be through indirect mechanisms such as the lighting of a billboard causing a road sign to be silhouetted or difficult to read. So it's really anything which results in obstructing or hindering road users' views of critical other infrastructure. The third recommendation is to avoid complex locations. So billboards should be avoided in complex driving situations such as intersections and motorway exits or entrances. And the reasoning here and the sort of scientific reason for this is to do with the higher levels of attention and concentration required to drive safely in such situations. So a driver, needs to be ready to respond, to make decisions quickly, potentially in more complex situations, and therefore the consequences of being distracted may be more severe. And the examples given already include things like motorway exits and entrances, or also intersections. So adding to the mental demands of the driver at these points should be avoided. It's worth also noting that billboards should probably be avoided in situations where there are already many signs or existing billboards, as this can, again, create a complex situation and cause driver confusion or overload. The fourth recommendation concerns moving images. So advertisements with moving images and animation should not be used. The scientific justification for this is that movement, we know from decades of research that movement draws attention. And currently there's no clear evidence to define an amount of movement that is acceptably safe. And therefore we propose that at the moment, road authorities should prohibit moving images on billboards wherever possible. The fifth recommendation is all about what a billboard is encouraging in the driver. So billboards should never display content that encourages drivers to look for information or to perform some action which is not relevant to driving. So this could be a number of things. For example, you might have a series of billboards which are linked, where one is encouraging people to look out for the next one. Or you might have, as in the case here, an instruction to call now or text this number for information. And content such as this should be avoided, because what they're doing is they're encouraging drivers to modify their behavior in some way in order to be able to either view subsequent information or perform an action that is not relevant to driving. And that in itself is a potential risk. The sixth recommendation concerns keeping things simple. So any advertisement on a billboard should be concise, legible, and simple to understand. And the reasoning here, again, there's the scientific evidence for this and common sense. The more information there is on a billboard, the more difficult it is to read. And potentially the more complex it is to understand. And in all these cases, this will keep drivers' attention off the road for longer. And potentially they might have to look away from the road for longer if they're interested in the billboard. And of course, the longer drivers spend looking away from the road, the less safe the situation is. The seventh recommendation concerns transitions on billboards which have multiple adverts. And the recommendation says that billboards which switch between adverts can be allowed, but the duration of display should be maximized so that the number of transitions is minimized. The reasoning behind this is that we know that the moment where one advert changes to another is more distracting than the adverts themselves. But what we don't know is, and there's no real way of quantifying what is acceptable and what isn't. So therefore, what we propose at the moment is that the number of transitions should be minimized by maximizing the display time of each advert. So these, of course, are on billboards where there's the ability to show one advert after another. So the recommendation is that we minimize the number of those transitions. And I guess it's a research gap to think about how transitions should be done. But for now, in the absence of that knowledge, just minimize the number of them. The eighth recommendation is quite simply that billboards which dazzle road users or which are excessively bright or reflective should not be allowed. We know that driving is predominantly a visual task. Now, dazzle, by definition, is temporary blindness, so that's clearly undesirable. Brighter things also draw more attention. So even in the absence of dazzle, consideration should be given to whether billboards are more likely to draw attention in the scene than other more task-relevant information. And of course, very bright billboards might even reduce the visibility of other road signs due to excessive relative brightness. And this is, of course, linked to recommendation number 2, which is all about blocking or hindering road users' views. The acceptable level, of course, of brightness on a billboard will vary depending on the road lighting, weather, and time of day, and so on. So this does require some consideration and thought by the road authority. The 9th recommendation concerns flashing lights, and it simply says that billboards with flashing, intermittent, modulating, or moving lights or moving parts should never be allowed. And this is kind of related to the earlier recommendation about moving images. It's the same reasoning, the same mechanism. Moving things, changing things grab more attention than stationary things, and therefore we feel at the moment represent an unacceptable level of distraction. It's worth noting that this could arise not through design, but just through poor maintenance. So, for example, broken light bulbs, flashing light bulbs, that kind of thing, which are flashing or moving around due to some kind of defect or lack of maintenance, is another thing that needs to be considered when considering this recommendation. And the 10th and final recommendation is that very, very large billboards, where the size itself will draw attention, should be avoided. The issue here, I mean, it's difficult to define an absolute size, but very large billboards are more likely to grab attention than smaller ones through their dominance in the scene and also through their tendency to be perceived as rapidly approaching and looming in the observer's vision. Now, the extent to which this is a problem will depend on how much of the visual scene the billboard takes up, but in short, this is something that needs to be considered. Very large billboards, which are close to the driver, are likely to draw attention just due to their physical size, so they should be avoided. So those were the 10 main recommendations. One final thing is that in addition to the project producing those recommendations, it also produced a set of recommended kind of next steps or actions for road authorities. And these are not aimed at aspects of the billboards themselves, but they're more about removing barriers and improving the processes around approval for different road authorities. There are 9 of these suggested actions available in the recommendations report, and they're kind of summarized at a very high level on this slide. So it considers things like developing and applying guidance and legislation based on the recommended practice that we've outlined, raising awareness among stakeholders, thinking about potentially a European standard in this area. And one important one is including billboards in road safety inspections and raising awareness of the need for regular maintenance to avoid some of the things we've talked about. And finally, there are some recommended next steps in terms of research to fill the knowledge gaps that have been identified. So that was a summary and overview of the ADVERTS project, and I'd like to thank you all for listening, all for your attention, and recommend that you please go and read the various other project outputs that we referred to earlier in this presentation. Thank you.